researcher in child development, training guidelines, and I'm an interview trainer with an international center called the Center for Investigative Interviewing. And I'm pleased to be chatting with you today about basic principles for forensic interviewing as children. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay. You've all probably got a good idea of what a forensic interview is, but what is it? How do we define it? And will defining it help us to understand the basic elements? Last year, a group of forensic interview trainers in the U.S. wrote a consensus document in the Juvenile Justice Bulletin regarding best practices for interviewing children. This was the definition that they used for a forensic interview. We're going to break this down into a couple of parts. First of all, it's developmentally sensitive. That's the first key. This is a conversation that recognizes the needs, the various limitations, and the strengths of the interviewee, and their level of social, cognitive, and linguistic development. It's a legally sound method of gathering factual information regarding allegations of abuse or exposure to violence and conducted by a neutral professional. So it's about gathering the facts. It's about figuring out what happened. This means avoiding biases, avoiding coercion or suggestion, avoiding the assumption that our only goal is to get a disclosure. The goal of a forensic interview is to gather the facts, whatever those may be, in a legally sound way. The interview is conducted by a competently trained professional. Interviewing, particularly of vulnerable witnesses and victims, is a very sophisticated skill that has to be taught and has to be practiced regularly, with opportunities for feedback and ongoing learning. The forensic interview utilizes research and practice-informed techniques. Okay, so these are your open-ended questions, things like conducting a practice narrative, and so on. And we're going to spend much of our time talking about this part today. And finally, keeping in mind that the forensic interview is part of a larger investigative process. It's one piece. It may be the most important piece, it may not. But either way, it's important to get high-quality information from the children that we're talking to. Michael Lamb and his colleagues have shown that high-quality interviews are associated with increased case resolutions, plea bargains, or convictions. All right, so that statement on what a forensic interview is boils down to three core concepts, two of which are going to be our goals for today. First of all, it's child-centered. And you're going to be hearing Meredith Kirkland-Burke talk about child development next week. So I'm going to skip making comments on that component. The other two are hypothesis testing, or gathering of the facts, and avoiding biases. And finally, what the research and practice tells us about eliciting best evidence from children, the prompts and the interview phases in a vulnerable witness interview. So one of the main overriding features of a forensic interview is that it's hypothesis testing, okay, rather than hypothesis confirming. So it means that during the interview, we attempt to rule out alternate explanations for the allegations. So we might start out with the idea that perhaps the abuse didn't happen. Maybe the allegation doesn't actually refer to criminal behavior. That means that we try to understand what children mean when they use sexual terms or they talk about body parts in an ambiguous way, for example. And we have the alternative hypothesis that actually maybe the abuse did happen. So we will work in both directions. And that means that we don't immediately assume that when children are inconsistent or they confuse details or they can't describe something in detail, that means the abuse didn't happen. Okay, so just to keep in mind that hypothesis testing is a bi-directional process. Okay, now I want to talk for a moment about allegations that are quote-unquote false to hopefully give you a better sense of the issues when hypothesis testing. When we think about false allegations, we often think about lying, and certainly that does happen, it can happen, but it usually represents a very small percentage of unfounded cases. Most of the time when there are errors or inconsistencies in children's reports, they come from somewhere else. So for example, you all know that leading highly suggestive, misleading questions, very specific questions, or poor questions that are repeated within or across interviews can all lead to errors in children's reports without there being any intention on the part of a child to lie. Some children use props and interviewing aids in ways that can introduce errors into their reports, and that's why child developmentalists consider them to be risky. Biases that we bring to the interview can lead to errors. For example, our nonverbal behavior. When we're leaning forward and listening and nodding more intently when the child is telling us something that we're expecting to hear or that we expect is related to the topic, and then sitting back or seeming to pay less attention when they're on another track. Our verbal responses work similarly. Children are susceptible to these kinds of influences because they'll tend to think of interviewers as authority figures, or at the very least, people who are expecting responses to their questions and who maybe know something about the events in question. And that's why we include ground rules in our interviews, which I'll talk about later. Now, there are things that children do as well that can introduce errors into their reports. And some of these have to do with their language. So things like meanings and pronunciations. Parents in the audience today will know that children don't always use words correctly. They often use words that they don't fully know the meaning of, and they can have funny pronunciations for things. These can lead to parts of their reports being misunderstood. They can also use language in an ambiguous way. They don't always remember that we don't know everything that they're talking about. They use pronouns like he and she and they all over the place without reminding us who they're referring to. Other sources of potential error that we should be aware of come from outside other places. Children do have good imaginations. Most of the children in the interview can separate fantasy from reality. If they've been asked a question or if they've been thinking about something, they may have trouble separating it later. So for example, if a child is asked a question that they don't know the answer to, they might say they don't know at the time, but the question has the potential to lay down a memory trace, like a little sticky note in their brains. And if that question or that topic is visited again, there is the potential that they'll confuse what they thought about with what really happened. Rumors, similarly, children can confuse rumors or things that they've overheard with things that have actually happened. They can confuse other similar events with the one that's being talked about. Or they might make what we call script-based errors. So this just means inferring that something happened because it usually happens that way. So for example, saying that mom was at work when dad started drinking because that's usually the way abusive episodes kicked off, but actually on that occasion, mom was just next door at the neighbor's and she was having some drinks herself. Okay, so that's a lot to keep in mind, and that's really just scratching the surface of how errors can crop up in children's reports without them being intentionally false, and without anyone suggesting or using a bunch of very overtly misleading questions. But there's ways around this, and there are ways that children can be very competent witnesses. So what's the best way to proceed? Well, let's look at it this way. Let's think about what is your goal when conducting a forensic interview? What is it? Why are you there? You know it's not just simply to get a disclosure. Your goal is really to find out what happened, right? What's their story? What's their narrative? And how do we get narrative accounts from children? Well, hopefully we can get narrative accounts by asking the best questions that we can and to let the children and adolescents before us shape and take charge of the accounts. Okay, so that takes us to the next segment of today's webinar. We're going to talk about interview prompts and question types. And you'll notice now for the next 10 minutes or so, at the bottom of the slides appears a link and a pin. This will take you to, if you want to play along, in about 10 minutes, we'll have a quiz on some of the question types. You're welcome to connect at the link, log in with the pin, and when we finish talking through the prompts, we'll go through, it's a 6-question quiz. Okay, so the golden rule in forensic interviewing is to ask more open-ended questions than closed or specific questions. And this sounds really simple, but the research suggests that we don't do that. And we also know that in our everyday conversations, we don't talk to each other using open-ended prompts. Open-ended prompts are ones that tap recall memory. So these are things that we have to retrieve from our minds. They encourage elaborative responses, detailed responses, or at least multi-word answers. And they don't dictate the content of the response. In contrast, closed questions tap recognition memory. They don't encourage elaborative responses, and they do dictate the content of the response. So we're going to get a little bit more specific on those question types now. The ones that kick off the topic of conversation or a new topic within the interview are typically called a first or an initial invitation. So this is a prompt like, tell me everything you can remember from the very beginning to the very end. The next most common open-ended question types are what are known as either the breadth prompt or the general invitation, depending on which literature, which interview protocol guideline you're reading, or the depth prompt or the cued invitation. Breadth prompts are the ones that get children to provide more broad detail about the overall event. So these are the open-ended prompts like, then what happened, what else happened, what happened next, tell me everything that happened. So kind of like getting a series of snapshots of what's gone on. Depth prompts are the ones that allow you to probe deeper into something that the child has already mentioned. So tell me more about when you got in the car. Tell me about the part where he sat down on the couch. You said, whatever, tell me more about that. Now, understanding that there are different kinds of open questions will help you to use them more flexibly in your interviews. If you're already asking open questions, but we're starting often with something like tell me more, so tell me more, tell me more, tell me more about that. You know, if you've had this experience, you know that children get frustrated with you, and those open-ended questions stop working so well. So being able to use different question stems, being able to use open-ended prompts that sound a little bit different from each other is going to help you get different kinds of information from children and help them to keep talking. There's 2 other kinds of open-ended prompts that are maybe a little bit less common, but you may have seen before. These are time segmenting prompts. So these are ones that help you to narrow down the account or to help children focus on a part of the account you want more information on. So something like, tell me everything that happened from the timeline part where he sat down on the bed until he left. Or tell me everything that happened from the time you got up this morning until the time you came to see me today. This kind of prompt can be particularly helpful for children who are bouncing all over the place or who are doing what some people call the basketball approach to disclosure. So for example, you're giving them open-ended prompts at the beginning of the interview, they're giving you information, and then they get to the part that they don't want to talk about. So this is can be particularly relevant in sexual abuse interviews. So they tell you lots of things, and then they say, and then he did the thing. That's your basketball bounce. and then they'll give you some more information later on. So time segmenting prompts can help you narrow in on that bounce part of the account. The other type is a sensory focused prompt. Tell me how everything looked. Tell me how everything felt. Tell me how everything sounded. Or tell me about all of the things you saw or heard. In my experience, these prompts don't work as well as we feel like they should. There's not a lot of research on them in isolation. The reason that they don't seem to work as well is because I find you often get a very vague response to these prompts. So tell me how everything felt. It felt bad. It looked bad. But nevertheless, they are available to you. They're considered open-ended prompts. They're considered good prompt types. You might have noticed, though, that the prompts on this slide, they tap recall memory. They encourage elaborate responses, even if they don't always get elaborate responses. They are considered open-ended, but they're more narrow in focus than those prompts that we talked about just a few minutes ago. So they do more heavily dictate the content of the response that you're looking for. Now, arguably, the next best thing that we can do in an interview is really just to shut up. In other words, the next best questions are not to ask questions. Silence can be an incredibly effective tool in an interview. And you have to feel out different children. Some children don't respond to silence as well. There may be cultural differences across children, too, in how they respond to silence. But those things aside, children's cognitive processes are slower than adults. They do need to think longer than an adult would about a question that you asked or the memory they're trying to dredge up. Or maybe it's an uncomfortable thing and they're still trying to decide whether that's information that they want to share. Okay, so being patient and being silent can be really helpful. And remember, when we're not asking questions, we can't be asking quote-unquote poor questions. Now, as I mentioned, silence isn't always effective. It's not always effective for every child. Sometimes they need a little bit of encouragement to keep going. So minimal encourager or a facilitator, these are things like, yep. These tell children, I'm still here. I'm still listening. And importantly, they tell children, it's still your turn. It's still your conversational turn. Now, the hardest thing about minimal encouragers can be that sometimes we use them too frequently, particularly when we have a child that we think might want to get up and leave or something like that. And every time they say something, we say, yep, It can start to sound more like we're rushing them than that we're encouraging them along. So just something to keep in mind when you're using this type of a prompt is to just take a beat before you do it. Paraphrases. A simple paraphrase is just repeating back a child's statement verbatim. So the child says, he hit me, say he hit you. For younger children in particular, and in general, adding a request for elaboration on the end of the paraphrase tends to work better. So repeating the child's words, he hit you, tell me more about that, tends to be more effective. Now, summaries. I also put summaries on this slide because they're non-questions. This is when we summarize key points of the child's account and then ask them to continue or ask them if there's any more information. There can be some problems with this approach. Not always, but something to consider is who decided what was important? Who decided what were the key points? We as interviewers. And doing that can disrupt the child's narrative. What it does is it puts the conversational ball back on your side of the field. And when we do summaries, we do a lot of talking. And it's the first time, it may be, if we're asking lots of open-ended questions and the child is talking, it may be the first time that we start doing a lot of talking again. And particularly children who didn't really want to talk that much in the first place might go, okay, you know, thank goodness I'm done. Now the interviewer is going to do the work. Now the next level of question types are the directives. These are your who, where, when, why, how or how come, and sometimes what. Okay, so things like who is Joe? Where did he put his hand? So they're recall questions, but they're more specific than open-ended questions because they dictate the content of the response. You're looking for specific responses to these questions. Children's ability to understand prompts like who, where, and what develop the earliest. These are, for the most part, these are concrete things. So who is a person, where is a place, and what is often a thing. They're things that you can see or touch. Now, what questions can sometimes get tricky in terms of trying to decide whether they're open-ended or directive? I like to think of them as being narrow or broad. So narrow what questions dictate the content of the response. What color was the car? What did you have for breakfast? On the other hand, what happened next? This lets the child choose pretty freely what they're going to tell you. They can talk about the immediate next thing in the event. They can bounce the basketball and skip ahead. The content is not as heavily dictated in the question. Questions like why or how come, when, and how are more challenging for children. They should be avoided when possible, especially with younger children. Questions like why did you say something or how come you said something, they're not horrible questions, but they're not great questions either. And oftentimes, children may not know why they did something or why they said something. And oftentimes, adults don't either. Questions like why do you think or why did someone else do something invite speculation. And so generally, we want to avoid inviting speculation with any witness. When questions, just broadly speaking, any question about timing tends to be difficult for children to answer. And this is not just young children, but children up even 11, 12 years old and adults are not great at specifying time. How questions, things like how do your pajama pants do up, how does mom get to work, most of the children that we interview are able to answer questions like this. And again, they're not terrible, but just keep in mind that the younger the child that you're talking to, the harder these kinds of questions will be. Questions about frequency, duration, measurement, other people's ages generally tend to be difficult for children, and most importantly, if they give you answers to these questions, there's the potential that they could be wrong, and the potential that, the reports could be criticized later, or there could be inconsistencies in their reports as a result of them trying to answer these types of questions. So what's the consensus on directives then? Well, they're considered less desirable than open-ended questions, but better than truly closed questions. Younger children may benefit from directive prompts if they're having trouble responding to open-ended prompts. Sometimes questions like, tell me everything that happened, what else happened, are just too broad for younger children, and they stray away from the topic of interest. So if you do need to use directives, and particularly with younger children, try to stick with who, where, and what, and then follow those up with open-ended prompts. And the answers to other questions hopefully may come out in children's narratives if they're given a lot of time to talk, or you may be able to follow up with non-offending caregivers. So an example of pairing a question is something like, where were you in Nana's house? And say the child says, we were in the closet. Okay, tell me what happened in the closet. So opening it back up and inviting the child then to elaborate and to narrate again. Children are less suggestible in response to the directive prompts than to the more closed questions, which we'll talk about in a moment. So this is why they're generally considered better, safer than the more closed questions. Children are more likely to say, I don't know, when asked a WH question than a closed question. So that takes us into the closed questions. And again, they should be avoided as much as you can because children do have the tendency to guess at responses. One type of closed question is a yes-no question. Something like, did Gary do something bad? Now, sometimes you want to ask a yes-no question because you want to verify some information. So something like, Mom said you were upset about something. Were you upset? If you need to do something like this, this is the perfectly acceptable reason to use a yes-no question. So although we should try to avoid them, you shouldn't feel afraid to use them if there's circumstances that you need them in. Now, on the topic of yes-no questions, questions that start with can you are often considered by trainers and researchers to be yes-no questions. Okay, so a can you question like, can you tell me everything that happened yesterday? We do this when we ask questions because we're trying to be polite. We're trying not to be so forceful, tell me what happened. And most of the children that we interview, they do know that that's a polite request, that really you're not asking, can you tell me? You're asking them to tell you. But some children don't, and more importantly, it gives children permission to say no. So the children who are a little bit reluctant in the first place, when you ask them, can you tell me, they might say no, and we just want to avoid that where we can. Another type of closed question is a forced choice question. So this is one that gives children 2 or more options. Things like, were your pants on or off? Was it spring, summer, fall, or winter? Okay. The children do have a tendency to choose an answer, even if the correct answer is not in the question. So that's the danger with forced choice questions. So oftentimes interviewers, if you're in a situation where you need to ask a question like this, interviewers will add an or something else option. So this is to ensure that the question isn't leading. An example would be, were your pants on, off, or some other way? Because children have a tendency to choose one of the options, let's say that pants are pulled down. They're on, but they're pulled down. Many children will just choose an option rather than elaborate, but by giving them some other way, lets you at least follow up on that information if they try to describe that it was another way. So that takes us then into leading questions. Leading questions or leading prompts are any type that introduce information that hasn't been mentioned by the child or that imply that a specific response is expected. So consider the following brief scenario. Jamie reported that her Uncle Gary babysat her on the weekend. She said that they baked and decorated some snacks, and then they watched a gross movie with naked people, and Gary put a blanket over his legs, and he did something weird. And then when it was bath time, he wanted to help wash her. So which of the following prompts is leading? I'm going to put 6 prompts up now. I want you to be thinking about which one or ones is leading. The first question in the Kahoot is going to ask you which prompt or prompts are leading. And the scenario will not be visible on the screen anymore. The remaining questions will be visible on the Kahoot. So just give yourself a moment to read the scenario again and think about which prompt you're leading. Gary was watching porn, wasn't he? Tell me about the part where your uncle washed you. What did he say during the movie? Did he do anything weird while you made snacks? Were his pants on or off under the blanket? So you said your Uncle Gary is gross. Okay. I'm going to shift to the Kahoot now. Okay. So if you have logged into the website, or you logged in, if you've connected to the website, you can enter the game PIN, 218590. We'll give about 30 more seconds and let people log in, and then we'll go ahead.
Hello. I'm good. How are you doing, Dennis? Yeah, no problem. Uh-huh.
All right,
Okay.
let's start. Oh, okay.
Oh.
All right. While we get set up, we've been asked to mention that somebody that's logged in is talking on their cell phone, and that can be heard. So please, yeah. So if you're on your cell phone, please either end the call or move away from your computer. Okay. So right. So the first question there was which ones were leading, and it looks like we've got a response. All of them? Yeah, they are all leading, and we're going to talk about those leading questions really briefly after we finish the Kahoot questions. So there's 5 more questions on question types. So what type of question is this? What color was the car? Okay. All right, so we've got 3 for direct and 1 for breadth. That's right, it's a direct question. So what color was the car is CAP's recall memory, but it's a narrowly focused question. We're not looking for an elaborate response. We're looking for a short answer, the color of the car. All right, next question. I went to Jason's. We ate chips, watched TV, and played PlayStation. Which follow-up question is the most open? Tell me what game you played on PlayStation. What did you watch on TV? What happened after you played PlayStation? And can you tell me more about when you went to Jason's? Okay, so the question, all right, so you've probably noticed that what happened after you played PlayStation, which is the correct answer, and can you tell me more about when you went to Jason's? Or in many regards, both open-ended. The question that's the most open-ended is one in yellow. What happened after you played PlayStation? It's a Brett's prompt or a general invitation. The reason that we consider this one more open than can you tell me more about when you went to Jason's is because of the can you in front of the prompt. So that was meant to be tricky, and I see that it was. Okay. There might be some questions about that one after the talk, and that would be great. All right, what type of question is this? Did it happen one time or more than one time? Open-ended, forced choice, directive, or leading? Oops. I think it looked like everybody got that. It was a forced choice question. That's right. There were two options, one time or more than one time. Question 5, identify the subtype of open question. Tell me more about the part when she pulled your hair. An initial or first invitation, breadth or general invitation, depth or cued invitation, or a sensory focus prompt. Okay, good. A little bit of a spread here. So the breadth or the general invitation, 2 answers there. Depth or the cued invitation, 4 answers there. Yeah, and that's the correct answer. So because it probes deeper into something the child's presumably already mentioned. So tell me more about the part when she pulled your hair. Tell me more about what happened when. So going into more detail about something that child has said, in contrast to a breadth or general invitation, which is something that's going to get you to another part of the event. So a comparison would be tell me what happened after she pulled your hair. So that's going on further into the event versus probing deeper about a single detail. Okay, last question. Identify the breadth question, the general invitation. And then what happened? Did it happen every weekend? How long did it go on for? You said he smashed the bottle. Tell me about that part. Yep, again, so a little bit of a spread again on those breadth versus depth prompts, and that's where you're split. So the correct answer is, and then what happened? That is the breadth question. So you can think about it as wanting to know more broadly, wanting more broad information, wider information about the whole event, versus a depth prompt, thinking more deeply, delving more deeply into an aspect. So you said he smashed the bottle. Tell me about that part. That's narrowing the focus of the conversation. All right, great. So that was just a kind of a chance for you to maybe do a little bit of thinking instead of just listening to me. But that's over. So we're going to go back to the PowerPoint now. Hang on. Okay. Yeah. All right. Now, I'm just wanting to chat really briefly before we get back into it about leading questions. I noticed that I think everyone got this correct, but nevertheless, yeah, they are all leading, or at least they can be argued to be leading. Every question here either implies some kind of an answer, so particularly things like Gary was watching porn. That one's fairly obvious. Pants on or off, or they introduce information that the child hasn't said. So saying something during the movie, the washing her, she never said he did, she just said he wanted to help. Asking whether something weird happened during the snack making. Or it makes inaccurate connections between things that children said. So she never said that Gary was gross, she said that the movie was. In any case, it looks like he caught all of those. Okay, so that takes us into the final major component of today's talk. And that will be interview phases, or common interview phases in vulnerable witness interviews. There are a variety of interview protocols or guidelines out there, and they're becoming increasingly more similar to one another all the time. This is because we're getting greater and greater consensus from the research field about what's good and what's not so good to do in interviews with children. These are just a few of the most commonly used guidelines, at least in this part of the world. The NICHD protocol is certainly the one that's associated with the most research. And Tom Lyon's 10-step interview is a condensed version of NICHD with some adaptation. The NCAC guidelines from the US, the National Children's Advocacy Center. The standard interview method, which is used primarily in Australia, but also parts of North and South America. Achieving best evidence, originating and has been used for a long time in the UK. The stepwise guidelines from John Yule's group in BC. And developmental narrative elaboration, corner house interview, and child first having originated out of the US. Now, despite some differences across these protocols and guidelines, there are a number of features or main phases that are really common and pretty standard now for all child interviews. Most start with some kind of an introduction in which, in fact, all of them start with some kind of an introduction in which we tell children who we are. So, my name is Sonja, my job is to talk to kids. And then we get the child's name, their birthday, maybe their age, for the purposes of the video record. We clarify the purpose of the interview, and we clarify that the child is going to be asked questions and that the child is going to be talking. The child's not just a passive observer. They're an active participant. So something like, you know, my job is to talk to kids, your job is to tell me the truth about what happened as best as you can. And we might omit or slightly change an instruction like this a little bit when we talk to adolescents. But particularly with younger children, giving them a sense of purpose can be helpful. And then commonly children will be oriented to the room, allowed to get comfortable. You'll spend some time explaining the purpose of the video recording or the two-way mirror or both, but without making the child feel like the focus of being watched. So something like, the video camera will record what we talk about today. Putting the focus on you. Someone I work with is watching to make sure I don't forget to ask you anything. I might write some things down because I have a bad memory, and I don't want to forget what we talk about. Or I talk to lots of kids, and I don't want to mix up your information with theirs. So it takes the focus away from them and puts it onto you, while still telling them very genuinely what the purpose of the room features are. So the main interview is comprised of two phases. The introductory phases, so rapport building, ground rules, and a practice narrative, and then the substantive phase, or the getting the allegation phase. So we'll start with introductory phases. Now, what is rapport? Rapport is often described as a phase, so for example, the rapport building phase, but really it's so much more than that. It's a way of being. It's a conversational dynamic that you want to build at the beginning of the interview, but it's going to wax and wane throughout the conversation as more sensitive topics come up, and rapport might diminish a little bit. It may go back up, but it's something that we want to try to generally maintain throughout the interview. It's been defined as creating a relaxed and comfortable feeling, a productive interpersonal climate, and a harmonious, empathetic, or sympathetic relation or connection to another self. Regardless of how we define it, we often can feel when we've achieved some level of rapport. And better rapport tends to be related to increased disclosure. And this is in any kind of situation, not just in a forensic interview, but even between two people in the sharing of details that are secret or that we don't share broadly. So better rapport is related to increased disclosure and decreased suggestibility. So how do we achieve all this? Hopefully, how do we achieve rapport? Using the child name from time to time during the interview can help. It often brings children's attention back to you. It increases their feeling being listened to. Praising them for effort, not the content of what they say, but something like, I can see that you're thinking really hard, or, thank you for sitting still if it's a younger child. Making eye contact is good, but not staring, and recognizing that children may not want to make eye contact with us. They may be looking away, but if they look to you, that you're looking at them rather than, say, at a clock, at your phone, or at the paper that you're writing on if you're taking notes. Using a relaxed voice, having an open seating posture, leaning forward, smiling when it is appropriate to do so. And you may not always have control over it, but if you do, wearing casual dress instead of a uniform, being in a comfortable setting, conducting the interview at a relaxed pace, so not rushing the child. All of these things can help. And establishing rapport early. So one way to do that is through narrative practice, which we're going to come to in a moment. Now, usually next, interview protocols may deliver some form of ground rules or interview instructions near the beginning of the interview. Some don't. Some omit them entirely or only use them during the interview when the opportunity arises, if it does. And in the revised NICHG protocol, they come after the practice narrative instead of before it. So there's not a lot of consensus over where ground rules should be or even how effective they are. People who support the use of ground rules believe they're needed because the forensic interview differs so much from everyday conversation. That's partly in terms of the questions that are asked, but also because kids are used to being the students rather than the experts. They're used to being asked questions by adults who already know the answer to what they're asking. What ground rules are supposed to do is they're supposed to highlight children's role as the expert, facilitate the understanding of the interview purpose, reduce the power dynamic between the child and interviewee, and through doing those things, they're thought to increase accuracy or decrease children's suggestibility. Now, incidentally, I want to make a comment that I am a supporter of ground rules. I do think that they have a purpose and a place, but I know that there's a lot that we still don't know about them, and I think that the research field has a lot of work to do in this area in terms of when to deliver them, which kids are best to deliver them to, and in what manner, and so on. The most common ground rules are telling the child that they're the expert and that you're naive. So something like, I wasn't there, I don't know what happened. Telling children that they should tell you when they haven't understood something or when you don't know what I mean. That they should tell you if you said something wrong, correct me or tell me if I make a mistake. And probably by far the most common, telling children that if you don't know the answer, it's okay to say, I don't know, or don't guess. And coupled with, in a lot of cases, a lot of protocols, coupled with a statement like, but if you do know, I want you to tell me, or I need you to tell me. And that's because several studies have shown that children who are given a don't know ground rule and practice it and are familiar with using it do say, I don't know, more often in their interviews. And by giving them an instruction that if you do know, you should tell me, seems to counter that. The last three are a little bit less common, but still maybe used. Telling children that you might ask them something more than once, and that doesn't mean that they got it wrong the first time. Maybe you've just forgotten it or you didn't write it down. It's telling children it's okay to use any words that you want in this room. It's okay to take a break anytime you want. So as I mentioned, the research literature is a little bit mixed with regard to how helpful ground rules are. Each rule has been studied in isolation. And the reason for that is because different rules can be understood by kids at different levels of their development. And I could, and I have actually given whole workshops on ground rules, but for the purposes of today, I just want to leave you with a couple of quick takeaway notes. So don't know is the easiest ground rule. I did some research with Deborah Poole in the US and Jason Dickinson, looking at large samples of kids, and we found that between the ages of 4 and 5 years old, non-maltreated children could understand what this rule meant and they could use it. Delivering a practice example along with the ground rules does help. So something like, if I asked you my dog's name, what would you say? And if children guess, then we correct them and we give them another example. Okay, so if I asked you my sister's name or something like that, or if I asked you how much money I have in my pocket. So making sure that they get that they're supposed to say, I don't know here. Now, some of the recent work that I've done with Martine Powell and our colleagues is showing that the don't understand and the correct me rules are more challenging. And so even children at age 9, they could understand the rules, they could practice them and give accurate responses, but later in the course of an open-ended interview, they weren't using them. Okay, so from a child development perspective, which I'm not going to go into too much today, but these are more difficult rules. It's fairly easy to recognize when someone asks you something that you don't know the answer to, right? And kids are pretty used to saying, I don't know. But it's harder to recognize sometimes when we haven't understood something that someone said, or that there's maybe a small error in their question. Now, a point from this is don't assume that older kids and adolescents can't benefit from ground rules. Our work with children age 9, up to age 9, is suggesting that really some of the older children and adolescents might be the ones who can benefit from these rules the most. And there's ways to make examples more relevant to them, right? The final thing to consider is that the better our interviews are, and the fewer questions we're asking, and the more open-ended questions we're asking, the lower the need there is for ground rules. All right, now what about the truth-lie instructions? What are those? What questions or examples are you using to deliver truth-lie instructions? Well, they're not needed in our interviews in Canada, and they're really not a good idea. Asking children questions about truths and lies doesn't really do much more than test their vocabulary and test their comprehension for abstract concepts. They're not predictive of children's truth-telling behavior. So I'm going to say that again. Any child's ability to tell you, to tell me what the truth means, or what's the difference between a truth and lie, or to identify statements as truths and lies, isn't related to whether or not they will tell the truth. And in fact, the more able they are to explain about truths and lies, the more capable they are of lying. So if you think for a minute about if you've ever interviewed a 3-year-old, that 3-year-old who, you tell them a truth-lie instruction like, if you say something like, I'm running right now, is that a truth or a lie? That 3-year-old probably doesn't have any idea what you mean, and they're a poor liar as well. So instead, what we need to do is elicit a promise. So something like, this is a common example. We always need to talk about the truth, things that really happened. I need you to promise to tell the truth when we talk today. Do you promise that you will tell me the truth? Okay. And the final component of the introductory phase is the narrative practice, also known as episodic memory training. And I'm giving you multiple terms for some things like the open-ended questions and the narrative practice because these are ones that you will come across if you get some of the research literature or from different training from different people. So just want to make sure that you have both terms available to you. So narrative practice this is when we spend a few minutes talking to children before we get to the allegation phase about a neutral or a pleasant topic that's unrelated to the abuse or the target topic. And here the research has been pretty conclusive that practice is beneficial to children's reports. So these are some of the benefits of narrative practice. It practices the child in responding to open-ended questions, to providing detail, and to being the expert. It promotes more efficient responding because it gets them used to providing details in response to open questions. It builds and maintains rapport, or it can have that function. It gives the interviewee a few minutes to get settled. And what's really interesting is a few years ago there was a survey done with older teens who were victims of sexual assault, and they had come into the police station, and one of the things they talked about their experiences being interviewed, and they had positive experiences and they had negative experiences, and it really ran the spectrum. But one of the things that many of them mentioned was they just wished that they'd had a few minutes to just chat before they had to give this sensitive information. So it gives the interviewee just a few minutes to get comfortable, a few extra minutes. It practices you in asking good questions. This can be particularly relevant to if you're someone who's not doing interviews often. It gets you warmed up, asking open questions, and that can be really helpful. It also can allow you to assess children's communication and their language ability before you get to talking about the more difficult topics. You can look at whether their communication is similar between the practice and the substantive or the allegation phase. Or are they giving all kinds of detail and sharing lots of information during the practice phase, and then during the allegation phase, they're really only able to say, you know, somebody did the bad thing, somebody did the bad thing. Now, I want to be very clear that that's not diagnostic, and you cannot assume that because a child is communicating differently from the practice to the allegation phase, that means the abuse didn't happen. But it is just something else that you can take into account in the whole picture. It also might give you a sense of reluctance. So children who are really not wanting to talk may already be kind of shutting down during the practice phase. And you may want to spend some more time, extra time with those children. Now, with regard to choosing a topic for the practice phase, it's really important to get children narrating about an event, rather than just, say, listing things that they like to do, or, for example, telling you about the plot of a book or a movie. Those are something that obviously not happened to them, so we want to try to get them narrating about an event that's actually happened to them. And it's a good idea to practice them in eliciting episodic information. So by that, I just mean something that's from a specific time, a specific event in time, something like the school dance on Friday night, or the last time the child went to swimming lessons. Now, the optimal length of a practice narrative isn't clear from the research literature, but from the minimal research that's been done, it's been suggested that somewhere between 3 and 7 minutes is probably going to be sufficient for most children. You might want to feel out your child, though. If you feel like they need more time, you may need to give them more time. Now, there's definitely some debate about what to do if you're trying to conduct narrative practice and your child is in active disclosure. Okay, so they've come in and they are just ready to spill. Now, first of all, don't interrupt. Don't ever interrupt. Let them talk. When they've finished speaking, you need to use your discretion based on what they've said, whether or not you're going to try to do a practice narrative. I'm just going to suggest this. It depends on what the child said. right? Okay, so you have to think about, some children will come in and they know more or less why they're here, and they're ready to say a disclosure. They're ready to say something like, let's say, Grandpa Carl did a rude thing. They've been told that they're to come in and share that information. And sometimes kids do that when you ask them for the promise. So you ask them if they'll tell you the truth today, and they narrate something that's true, that's their disclosure. So I'm going to suggest that that's a disclosure you might feel comfortable taking a few minutes away from, telling you they know why they're there. And if the child comes in and launches into a full narrative and, it's several minutes before you have a chance to say anything, then you're probably going to want to forego practice. Now, if you do decide to attempt narrative practice, we could just say something like, thank you for telling me that. Thank you for sharing that with me. That's what we're here to talk about today. First, I'd just like to spend a few minutes getting to know you. Is that okay? But you need to follow the child's lead. If the child persists with the disclosure, you need to go with that. I'm just going to return to the benefits of narrative practice for a second just to talk about why we suggest that you consider trying to do narrative practice if it's appropriate to do so. Oftentimes, kids are or can be willing to spit out the disclosure. So something like I said, Grandpa Carl did a rude thing. That's what they've been prepared to do. But no one's prepared them for the fact that they're going to have to do a lot more than that, that they're going to have to narrate. They're going to have to respond to open questions and provide details. And so there is a risk that even if you can pull them into giving an account, they're going to expect you to do the work. They're going to expect you to ask the questions and them to give short answers, and that's what they're used to doing. That also gives you some sense of where your rapport is going to be at or a sense of reluctance. So it's a consideration. All right, the other major component, obviously, to a forensic interview is the allegation phase or the substantive phase. And these are the topics we're going to talk about for the rest of the webinar today. The transition, getting a narrative, exploring repeated events, some focus questions, and closure. Okay. When transitioning to the substantive phase or the topic of abuse, it's important to start as broadly as possible and then get more specific if you need to. Well, you want to try to avoid getting specific if you can. So many interviews will start off with, or allegation phases start off with something like, tell me what you've come to talk about today. Kathleen Sternberg and Michael Lamb found that roughly 85% of children who had previously disclosed sexual abuse were responsive to this kind of a transition prompt. They gave some kind of responsive information. Now, some recent work that I've done with Martine Powell is showing that the what question might be better than the why question. So the what question is what you've come to talk to me about. The why question is, tell me why you've come to see me today, or something like that. In a large sample of about 400 kids, we asked half of them the what question and half of them the why question. And we found that 72%, almost 3/4 of children aged 5 to 9 gave an informative response to the what question, versus only 42% to the why question. So what the kids were doing in response to the why question often were saying, I don't know. Now, of course, you can get around that. You can continue, but we want to avoid those things as much as we can. So let's say you're starting off on the right foot. Okay, you've asked a good transition prompt, and let's say you haven't gotten a disclosure. Then you need to get more specific. So we continue to try to start as broadly as possible. So I understand something may have happened to you. Tell me everything that happened from the beginning to the end. And this is, incidentally, this is the first funnel prompt from the NICHD protocol. Maybe you have some information from the allegation history that you can use. So something like, I heard you saw a nurse last week. Did you see a nurse? Or tell me what you talked about. Or I see that you have marks on your arm. Tell me about that. And from there, you might need to get a little bit more specific. Has anybody been bothering you? These are just examples. Has anything happened to you at, say, Grandma's place? Is your mom worried about something that may have happened to you? Tell me what she's worried about. And increasingly more specific, did someone do something to you that you don't think was right? What we try to do in the funnel prompts is stay as broad as we can and then get narrower if we need to. Also avoid mentioning topics of contention, so mentioning the suspect or trying to avoid mentioning the actual abuse. And it's going to depend on the case. It'll be case specific. You'll want to consult with your team depending on the level of risk, what other evidence there is, how specific you're going to go. Now, it's beyond the scope of this session to go into specific topics like reluctance, and I'm going to leave that hopefully to other presenters. So let's go with the assumption now that at least one of those prompts that we've discussed has gotten you a disclosure, something that you can work with. The next thing we need to do is figure out how to help kids flesh out those topics. So let's say you get some information with a verb in it, something like what happened on the bus or what Lewis did. These are the easiest ones to grab onto and ask a what happened kind of prompt. So I'm here to talk about what happened on the bus. Tell me everything that happened on the bus. What Lewis did, tell me everything that Lewis did. If we can turn them into what happened prompts, we want to do that. Children tend to be more responsive to prompts that ask them about actions than descriptions. So tell me everything Lewis did versus tell me about Lewis. Now, oftentimes what you get is a little bit more vague. So the bad man, the bad thing, my cousin, you just get this vague noun. Once again, you want to try to turn that into an action prompt. Tell me what happened with the bad man. Tell me what happened with your cousin. Now look at these last two disclosures. I want you to think about whether there's anything different about these two. When my dad gets mad, my mom being sleepy all the time. So tell me all about what happens when dad gets mad. You said mom's sleepy all the time. Tell me more about that. The difference between these last two disclosures and the earlier ones is that they suggest in the child's language that this might be a multiple incident that you're talking about. There may be more than one incident that you're going to have to question children about. And we're going to talk more about that in a second. So after you've got a disclosure and you've got a way to help children flesh that out, all best practice interview protocols then instruct us to elicit a narrative by exhausting open-ended prompts. Okay, don't forget to use a variety of them. Now, depending on the case and the kind of information that you need, you might want to, or you might be able to elicit a child's script of abuse. Okay, so what usually happens? Probably more commonly, though, you're going to need to get them to focus on individual episodes. You're going to need to ask them about specific times that it happened. Interviewing children about allegations of repeated abuse is a massive topic, but I'm going to cover a couple of really key points. First of all, it helps if we can identify what episodic versus scripted language sounds like. This is going to ensure that if we need to know about episodes, we're asking information about episodes. If we need to know what usually happens, we're asking for generic information. So in a child's language, we can look for things like past tense, verbs, specific information. So a child says something like, I went into the yard so she would stop yelling. Okay, so the verbs in past tense, this is something that you can see in your mind as a single time. In contrast to script language uses this timeless present tense, generic language, so something like, you've just got to get away from it. I go outside when she yells. You can see that this isn't a specific, the child's not thinking about one time. The child's thinking about what usually happens. And you can pull for different kinds of information in your own prompt. So if you want to get more of this script information, this picture of what usually happens, you can say things like, then what happens? You said she yells, tell me about the yelling. Or an unrelated example, what happens when dad's angry? If you need them to talk about an episode, then try to say past tense, then what happened? You said she yells, tell me about the last time, or tell me about one time when she yelled. Tell me about one time when dad got angry. And there's quite a bit of research now that has shown that children are pretty responsive to these kinds of prompts. So if you are prompting them with scripted prompts, they'll give you scripted information. If you prompt them with episodes, it increases the likelihood that they'll give you episodic information. Now there's a little bit of a caveat to what I just said. So although kids are responsive to the language in our prompts, if they've had a repeated abuse for a long time, many episodes over a duration, a lot of kids will just say it's all the same, right? They can't pick out one time from another. They all feel the same in their memory. They're all the same. And there's also motivational reasons why kids don't want to talk about individual episodes, and this is true of adults as well. If you need them to talk about episodes and just asking episodic prompts isn't enough, there are a couple of other things that we can keep in mind. So being aware of your language and theirs is important, but also listening to children's narratives for those episodic leads or labels. These are the little signifiers that tell you that there's something unique in the account. There's something that relates to an individual time. So kids might be talking about what usually happens and say something like, and one time he even did it when I was homesick from school. Or they mention something in passing, like I had my brand new Christmas pajamas on. That's a memory of an individual time. Or once when they were fighting, the neighbors complained about the noise. Okay, so kids don't always recognize that they're aware of this kind of information. They don't always recognize that it's there in their minds. And we need to find ways that we can help them identify what's unique, that we can help them find those features and pull them out. And if you listen for those kinds of things, you can use their words, hopefully, to label episodes. Okay. So after you've exhausted children's recall for the episode or the episodes, and you think that there's nothing more that you can get from a narrative account, then you might wish to take a break and consult with a monitor. This is really standard practice, but there's no guidance from the research community at all with regard to what to tell children during the break. Most interviewers tend to tell children pretty honestly what they're going to do. So I'm going to go talk to the person I work with to make sure I haven't forgotten to ask you anything. And you might have specific procedures where you work for that too. When you return, if you need to ask specific or closed questions, they should be used only if needed. And you always want to try to pair them with the open-ended questions. So trying to focus children in and then open it back up again. So something like, earlier you said he took off his pants. Did something happen to your clothes? So the child says yes, or the child maybe says his hand went in or something. You say, tell me what happened to your clothes, or tell me more about that part. Now I just want to talk before we finish about a particular kind of focused question that might come up. It's that conversation about body parts that just never really seems to go anywhere. I shouldn't say never, but oftentimes it just seems to go down the wrong track. And those of you that have been convinced, not to use dolls and body diagrams, and that's all great. But then we need to find ways of getting that information verbally in a way that's just not so terribly awkward all the time. And this is one of those conversations. So this is an example that I have permission to use that's also been slightly edited. So the interviewer said to the child, and what do you use your private parts for? And the child said, going to the bathroom. Okay. And the interviewer says, yep, which bathroom? Well, the bathroom at everyone's house, really. Yeah, So the type of going to the bathroom. Your child's a little bit lost at this point, right? So the child says the suspect's bathroom. The interviewer doesn't have a response immediately to that, and the child says it's got a blue tub and the toilet's blue too. And there's a sink, and the sink is kind of close to the toilet. And the interviewer is ready to repair at this point, right? Something's just not gone right. I should have asked that a better way, shouldn't I? Now this goes on for another few minutes, another couple of questions back and forth, and it doesn't get any better. The interviewer says, no, I mean, when you go to the toilet, and what do you do? What do you do when you're going to the toilet? And the child says, you face that way. If the toilet's that way, then you face that way, right? So, and I don't honestly remember where this went after this, but this is kind of a common example of how sometimes this conversation just gets derailed, and it can be challenging for everyone. So a few years ago, colleagues of mine, Kimberly Burrows and Martine Powell, did a whole series of studies in Australia where they went around speaking to a lot of prosecutors around the country. And so I want you to take this with a grain of salt. I put it at the bottom of the slide too. These are Australian prosecutors. So we don't have comparable research here in Canada, and you'd have to discuss these things with your prosecution team. But this is what the prosecutors in Australia suggested, and I think it's just interesting to maybe have a discussion about that. First of all, they said, well, in the interview, when the child's talking, would a lay person understand what body part the child is referring to, given where that interview is taking place, the cultural and social context? So, for example, in one of our interviews, if a child is talking about his dick, in our part of the country, probably a lay person is going to understand that, right? If that's the case, then no clarification is required from the child in the interview. It may come up later, but during the forensic interview, the prosecutors are saying, leave that bit. If a layperson wouldn't understand, so let's say the child says something, she's talking about her flower or her sunshine. Can someone else provide a statement about the child's meaning for the term? So can the non-offending caregiver answer a question about what that means? If so, again, the prosecutor said that's a question best left out of the forensic interview. If not, then they suggested that, yes, clarification will be required from the child at the conclusion of the interview. And even if your prosecution team says, no, absolutely, we still need clarification at the conclusion of the interview. This is what they suggest might be effective in a few simple, age-appropriate directive questions to get at that information. So what is your sunshine? What is your flower? Where is your flower? What do you use your flower for? So they're not really all that different than the conversation that we saw that went wrong, but the idea is to kind of keep them very simple, very short, very age-appropriate questions. Okay. Now, after we get to the end of the interview, you finish with your focus questions, you want to thank the child for speaking to you. Ask them if there's anything else that they want to talk about. Ask them if they have any questions for you. Importantly, let them know how to contact you if they want to tell you something further. If something else comes up, something else that they remember. And then shifting to a neutral topic, just making sure that kids are going home having chatted for a few minutes about something else. So what are you going to do after the interview today, for example? Okay. So I put a couple of resources up here for further information, as well as my contact details. I'm based remotely out of an Australian university, but I am Canadian and I'm from this area, so that phone number there is a Canadian phone number. And I'm going to leave it here. The last slide has some references on it, and that will be on your PDF that you'll receive after the webinar. But I'll just leave this here, and I wanted to open it up to questions for the last 10 minutes or so. I saw one like pop up and it kind of went away. Oh.
Can you elaborate why dolls and diagrams are discouraged?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So there's been research for the last probably 15 or 20 years, probably most of it focused on the dolls. And that emerged out of some of the infamous daycare cases that you might be familiar with, McMartin cases, the cases in the early 80s where dolls were being used in inappropriate ways, so in really suggestive ways to interview children. And that caused this huge body of research to just explode out of that. And there's some indication that it was the leading and the suggestive and questions and the ways that dolls were used that in and of itself was inappropriate, and that was making the dolls more difficult to use. As a result of that research, then the body diagrams came out, the two-dimensional diagrams, that it was thought that children would be less likely to see them as fantasy things, as toys, would be less likely to make these errors. And so in recent years, probably in the last 5 to 8 years or so, people have started to do research where they're doing better interviews with the dolls. So they're not asking suggestive questions. They're not asking leading questions. They're asking open-ended questions, and then at the end, maybe they'd bring out a doll or they'd bring out a body diagram and see how children interact with them. In those kinds of studies, the chances of getting errors are lower than those old studies with all the misleading information and poor questioning. But what the research is finding is that they're also not getting good additional information. So the verbal interview alone with good open questioning techniques is safer, and it's getting you as much as if you go to the dolls. The other problem, and so the reason that we still discourage dolls and drawings, even though they're safer when paired with a better interview than a poor quality interview, is because there's a minority of children, and we can't know which children they will be. Children who are cognitively immature, children who just have this need to interact with their environment. We call them environmentally dependent. They need to touch things. They're very sensory. These children will tend to respond to body diagrams and dolls in weird ways. So I did a study recently with Deborah Poole where we just looked at how kids interacted with body diagrams after a series of questions, not misleading questions, and a group of kids who were more cognitively immature would point to different places on the body diagrams, saying that they had been touched in those places when they hadn't. I mean, this was a lab-based study, so we knew that they had just interacted with us. They hadn't been touched. They would point to these places, and they would provide some information about touches that had happened to them. And the information that they provided, it was inaccurate, but it was related to something else that had happened at home. So, for example, I had a child tell me that I had touched him just 15 minutes earlier on his belly. And when I asked him to tell me why, he said, sorry, not to tell me why, but to tell me more about that, he said, you touched me there to feel my temperature if I'm burning up. So, I mean, this was an innocuous event, right? So we weren't expecting to get allegation reports, but this is a group of children that uses them in risky ways. It's a minority. And this has been shown in the field as well, that there are children who will respond to them in risky ways, and we can't know who those children are. That's why child developmentalists tend to consider them risky. Okay, but there is some debate. There's debate over the dolls and the diagrams, both among researchers and among practitioners. The best advice I can say is you try to conduct the best verbal interviews you can. That's the consensus kind of around the world. Try to get the most information by just letting the child talk. But I know that most most CACs, most interviews will have some body diagrams somewhere in case they need them to bring them out. And you need to make decisions with your team about individual cases. So I hope that's, I know that's a bit comprehensive. I hope that's helpful. I think I'm still sharing my screen. Do I just stop sharing?